Okay, so in this short lecture, we are going to talk about the emergence of American environmental policy and kind of where it stands today, at least at the federal level. This is very, very much like a 10,000 foot overview. We're not going to dig into this really deeply. So if it lacks a little bit of nuance, I think just remember that again, this is just a brief overview of policy. This isn't a class that focuses solely on environmental policy. There are classes at the U of M like that, but this class, it's a mixture of social science, environmental policy, and also environmental law as well, and some other things too. So just to give you a heads up there, let's get started. Okay, so environmental policy. Before we kind of get into the emergence of it, we're just going to define some key terms here. So basically, policy, another way that we can think about it is that it's a formal set of plans and principles to address problems and guide decisions. Policies can exist at many different levels and in many different kind of organizations or entities. And basically, these are like rules, they're regulations, they're plans, principles, that kind of stuff. Policies are really, in and of itself, like an ambiguous term, and it can mean a lot of different things. But the way I think that we can just think about it is like it's a general set of plans, principles, rules that help to address problems and help with decision making. Public policy is kind of a little bit more specific. It's policy that's made by governments that consists of laws, regulations, orders, incentives, guidelines, and practices. The key difference between policy and public policy is that public policy is made by governments, whether they're county, state, federal, what have you, right? Policies in general can be created and implemented by any kind of entity, from a business to a nonprofit to a government as well. But public policy specifically refers to policies that are made by governments. Environmental policy, on the other hand, is a little bit something that's a little bit different, a little bit more specific, and it means that these are policies that pertain to human interactions with the environment, or how we relate to the environment, how we treat it, that kind of stuff. So in other words, it regulates different things like resource use. It might mitigate pollution. Often a goal is to benefit public health. We think about pollution in that sense. And sometimes it is created for the benefit of plants, animals, flora, fauna, and ecosystems themselves. That kind of dichotomy is a little bit simplistic because, we do understand that, ecosystems don't exist without the humans in them, right? Like humans are an important player in all ecosystems really across the planet. There's a little bit of a false dichotomy there because we know that these systems are socio-ecological systems, right? And Mike talked about that a little bit during week 3. Okay, so really briefly, this is kind of the 10,000 foot overview thing. And going forward too, when we talk about the history of environmental policy, it's very much like an overview. But really briefly, framework of U.S. policy. Policies, these rules, often emerge from laws that result from actions of the different branches of government. These are the legislative branch, like they create statutory law, right? So this is Congress, this is House of Representatives, this is Senate. The judicial branch, which is the Supreme Court, is going to interpret those laws and how they're often practiced on the ground, and whether or not those on the ground practices align with the intent or meaning of the law. And then the executive branch, this is the White House, they enact or veto legislation then, and they also can issue executive orders without the Congress or the judicial system too. And ultimately, administrative agencies, these are the entities, the governmental entities at the federal level that ultimately enact laws, right? So these are agencies like the Forest Service, like the Bureau of Land Management, which has a lot of land in the western United States, the National Park Service, but also different agencies like the Food and Drug Administration and like the Center for Disease Control and Prevention too, right? So, even though this is a class on environmental policy, I do want us to think about other types of agencies, other types of policies too. Because I know that we have, I think it was 12 majors represented in our class, and I want us to all kind of understand that, the frameworks that we're talking about in class, while really, really important to environmental policy, also can apply to other agencies and other kind of entities like public health, education, what have you. So just a heads up there. Okay, so it's important also to note that state and local policies affect environmental issues. So important environmental policy is also created at the state and local levels. It's important to know that state laws can't violate principles of the U.S. Constitution, and if the laws do conflict with one another, the federal laws are going to take precedence. So we'll follow the federal laws. And now let's just get into early U.S. environmental policy, and then we're going to talk about the second wave, third wave, and kind of what it looks like today. So the first kind of formal environmental policy in the United States involved the use of public lands from the late 1700s to the late 1800s. The big thing was the public land survey system, in other words, known as the Jeffersonian grid system. And this is something that promoted settlement, and it also promoted the extraction of natural resources. And it was really tied to manifest destiny. The idea was that land to the west of the East Coast in the Midwest was thought to be kind of infinite and inexhaustible, right? So the Jeffersonian grid system basically divided, like really simply, and kind of doing gross overview here, but really simply divided the country up into these 160-acre plots of land, which were given away to folks who who would put work into them. Again, gross oversimplification, but don't want to get into it in too much detail today. So the second wave of U.S. policy after that Jeffersonian grid system was precipitated by this really kind of interesting paper. Of course, there's other ideas like kind of popping up around the same time that was related to this, but it was really precipitated in some ways by this frontier thesis paper called, the paper is called The Significance of the Frontier in American History. It was written in 1893, and this paper basically made the argument that the frontier was gone. Like there was no more land to settle in the West among predominantly white settlers going west. There's obviously big issues here with indigenous people and everything, and we're going to talk about that in this class, and we're going to integrate those perspectives in this class for sure. Lots of problematic stuff, kind of obviously. But this kind of acknowledgement that you couldn't settle any further west than the West Coast led to some attempts to address the impacts that were caused by this first wave, that were caused by manifest destiny. So at that time, the thinking was to create protected areas, things like national wildlife refuges, national parks. The National Forest System was created at that time too. So it really focused on conservation at that time. And this kind of reflected a different understanding that the West's resources were exhaustible and actually required some legal protection, and that the federal government could play a role in that legal protection. So after that comes the third wave of environmental policy. This is kind of the mid to late 20th century. The country at that point was better off economically in some ways among certain groups. Obviously we have in this country and have had in this country, pretty severe marginalization among groups, among different groups, and we don't want to overlook that. But I think the thinking of at the time was that overall the country was doing better off economically, but there's dirtier air, dirtier water, and more waste and toxic chemicals. Again, that often affected marginalized communities much more, and they were the communities that were often taking on risk, right, in ways that wealthier communities weren't. So just important to note there. And also, this third wave of environmental policy aligned with the rise of the field of ecology, and that's kind of important too. We were gaining a new understanding of ecological systems, how ecosystems worked, and that kind of stuff. So this is kind of an interesting parallel of policies being crafted with a recognition that pollution and other things were affecting people's health, were affecting environmental health, but also aligned with new scientific understandings of how the world works. At the time, there was an increased awareness of environmental problems, and this really shifted public priorities and policies to help address those problems. A landmark book was written. I'm sure everybody in the class has heard about this book. Maybe even many of us have read it, or at least excerpts from it. But a wonderful book called Silent Spring, written by Rachel Carson, was written. And this really, in a nutshell, described the negative ecological and health effects of pesticides and industrial chemicals, right? Silent Spring, DDT, no birds singing. This spring is silent because of these chemicals. A lot of significant environmental laws were passed during the third wave because the public demanded the cleaner environment and supported tougher environmental legislation. Some of these laws were created during Republican administrations, the Nixon administration specifically. So today we kind of associate, environmentalism with maybe the more liberal party in the U.S. But at the time, the executive branch was controlled by the Republicans. So interesting shift in maybe priorities of the different political parties over time. I'm not going to go through all these. You can press pause if you want and look at these, read these. But these are just key environmental protection laws during this time from 1963 to 1985. Right, so a couple ones here that I know we're going to talk about in class. We're going to talk about the Wilderness Act for sure. I think we talk about the Water Pollution Control Act. We get at the Endangered Species Act, Clean Water Act. So there are different things that we are going to talk about in this class. But I'd really encourage you all to look into these yourself if you're interested in any of these laws in particular. Okay, so if you're interested in environmental history, I have a really personal interest in environmental history, in the ways that kind of the contingent moments of history, where the unique ecological, economic, social kind of contexts all kind of come into play when we're understanding what happens at a particular moment in time. I think it promotes a humility, and I think that history is just a fascinating kind of discipline. But the Weyerhaeuser, maybe in an act of greenwashing, they have a series of environmental books that's published by the University of Washington Press. They don't write the books, like environmental historians write the books, who are all really amazing environmental historians. But there's a variety of books. One is about smell, the role of smell in 19th century America. One called Defending Giants is about the environmental movement in Northern California and Oregon. Wilderberg's is about the wildland-urban interface and just kind of issues surrounding that. And there's a variety of books. I'm not going to go through all these. This is a wonderful book series. I really encourage everybody to look at it, and it'll be great. All right, so today, really briefly, the modern U.S. environmental policy is often linked with different social, cultural, global issues. We're going to talk about a lot of this stuff in class, but these are things like climate change, climate justice, environmental justice. We think about international agreements. We think about a variety of different things that, in a lot of ways, recognize the connection between people and the environment. They recognize that marginalized communities will often take on more risk when we're talking about things like environmental degradation, pollution, that kind of stuff. So there's a little bit more of a recognition of that for sure. And I think that that's going to continue to to evolve as time goes on. But that's kind of like the bigger shifts today, is the conversations around policies, and some of the policies themselves kind of take into consideration the social, ecological systems, as opposed to just thinking about ecology or just thinking about ecosystems or just thinking about human health alone. It's kind of a recognition of the interconnected social, cultural, global issues with the environment. The Trump, so I'm going to talk about the Trump executive branch and then the Biden executive branch really, really briefly. The Trump executive branch, I think in in this class, I think this, looking back at the Trump administration, is going to be really, really interesting in the future, and I think it's interesting now. That we all know, I think that a lot of environmental rules were being rolled back under Trump and during the Trump administration. And we can discuss the merits and all, and we can critique that in various ways, and that's worth doing. It's interesting, but I think something that is going to be really interesting when we look back at the Trump administration is thinking about the things that they did to influence the work of on-the-ground workers in order to, some might argue, prevent them from doing some of the work that they're mandated to do, right? So really small things like moving headquarters of like the BLM from DC to Colorado is going to impact people's families who worked in DC and moving to Colorado. Things like moving the USDA researchers to Kansas City. These small things that are these seemingly small things that really affected the everyday work of folks on the ground, I think it's going to be really, really interesting to think about the impact of that. Because a very explicit goal of the Trump administration was to, I think, quote, like, dismantle the administrative state, right? That's their words. And I think, if that was their goal, they were really adept at it in terms of kind of making the work of on-the-ground bureaucrats a little bit more cumbersome. And I think that going forward, this kind of street-level bureaucracy framework is going to provide a really useful kind of framework for understanding what the Trump administration did to environmental policies and natural resource management. So I think like this kind of policy implementation framework that we're developing in the class is really going to help us understand that. So the Biden executive branch, it's a little bit, it's more focused on climate change. It's more focused on collaboration or cooperation with international bodies. The clean energy, the climate bill or the Inflation Reduction Act passed recently. There's going to be there might be lots of projects associated with that going forward. And there's just a little bit more of a focus on directly addressing some of these problems. I think, a Republican perspective might be that, by loosening regulations, that maybe a free market could help address some of these problems. That might be what a Republican administration would say and make the argument of, and we can debate the merits of that. I think a more liberal administration is going to make the argument, right, that the government plays a greater role in these decisions, and we can debate and critique that as well, right? But Biden and Trump's administrations really do take a very different approach to environmental policy, and that's kind of what I'm trying to convey here. Really important, I mentioned this when we talked about the third wave of environmental policy, but science plays a role in the emergence of and the development of environmental policies, but it also can be really politicized. It's important to note that effective policy decisions are going to be informed by the best available scientific research. Science is something that progresses over time. Science is a process. Any kind of scientific information that we've got is rarely definitive, and it's something that always changes and evolves, and we'll often learn more, and we'll build on science. I'm kind of presenting this idealistically, but that's the idea, at least with linear scientific progress. But also, it's important to note that policymakers are human. They represent human interests in our government, so they represent the public, or at least the public that they want to represent. And sometimes they are going to ignore science, or look at and consider different factors other than science when they are proposing and crafting laws, and ultimately the policies that the agencies ultimately are dealing with, right? So we know this, I think, but sometimes political ideology is gonna trump science, right? And sometimes scientists at different government agencies have had their work suppressed or discredited. This happened during the Trump administration with the EPA, and websites being taken down, databases being taken down, these different things that, again, if we look at this through a street level bureaucracy lens, is really interesting if we think about scientists as kind of the street level knowledge producers for the government, or in academics at universities or think tanks, without access to these big databases that the government has often hosted and supplied to folks. We kind of were challenged to do knowledge production in some ways. But that's it for this lecture. All I wanted to do in this lecture was to talk about the emergence of environmental policy in the United States, some of the issues around it, and also I want us to think really critically about how to approach not just the executive branch and the decisions that they make, but also the legislative branch, and even the judicial branch too. I think on a federal level, it's important to take all these things into consideration. And also, let's not forget the state and local level too. The science being politicized, the role of politics and political ideology is going to play a role in policy making that's related to the environment at kind of every level of government. So I hope this was helpful. Please let me know if you have any questions. Really happy to talk about any of this stuff with you, and I hope this was helpful.